rules for Marvel Snap's Snowball Showdown were made public, and I have some concerns. There are two major things differentiating the Snowball Showdown, which will take place on January 11th, and registration is open and free as of right now, from any other Marvel Snap tournament that has ever happened in the past. The first of those things is the cube rules that we used for the KMBest holiday block party will be in effect. Those cube rules are basically a way of rewarding people for winning bigger in the context of a conquest match. Generally speaking, if you're looking for pure competitive integrity, I think they do push against that, but they're not what I view as the problem. Having run a tournament with the cube rules, which are effectively how much you win by is going to be a better thing for you. Winning a big game is going to be better for you than winning a close game. That is fine, actually, from my perspective, having run a tournament with it. It felt like, and perhaps this is low sample size, it created more exciting, more interesting gameplay situations and made the broadcast of the tournament feel better. The actual problem, I think, is the way they've restricted the cards you can bring. For the KMBest Holiday Block Party, I pushed pretty hard to make sure that we could get 3 months worth of cards in, and we also did it at the end of a month, which meant that there were actually 3 months worth of cards in this pile. What they're doing for this tournament is 2 months worth of cards, but it's happening not even in the middle of the month, towards the beginning of the month, in the first week of the season. So effectively what this is, by saying you can play cards released in December and January, what you can actually play are cards released in December and cards released in the first week of January. This is a deck building restriction that is pretty stringent. Now, granted, you only have to run one of any of these cards in your deck to make it legal. But because of the way the cards in December were designed as sort of Wolverine-y synergy pieces, you kind of end up with a lot fewer decks being viable than you might think. To me, this looks like a bit of a hydrogen bomb versus coughing baby scenario, where you have things like the ramp deck, thanks to Chamber, being full-powered. You have things like any Maverick deck being full-powered. Shou-Lao seems like an expectedly powerful card. You'll be able to play a powerful meta deck with Shou-Lao in it, presumably. You have Nimrod decks, thanks to Adamantium Infusion, and you have maybe Aurora, maybe Phantom X, whatever you want to call like the tier 2 of this group. And then from there, it's just massive, massive drop-offs to cards that basically aren't seeing a ton of play, or we don't expect to see a ton of play. Cards like Dragon of the Moon that look absolutely horrific. Just a bunch of stuff. Weapon X Wolverine, which means you can play the Destroy deck with Deadpool, but you have to be playing Weapon X Wolverine in order to do it. Just a lot of interesting dynamics here that I think largely end up detracting from the metagame that this tournament would have, rather than being additive to it. When I see a tournament like this, I think the goal is to get a different metagame, to make things more interesting and enforce diversity so different things happen. And I think that there is a degree to which that is an admirable goal. If you want to see a Marvel Snap tournament, you don't want to see the same old decks winning it. The problem is that this specific restriction allowed for some of those same old decks to make it in and then hurt everything that beats them. When you look at what a ramp deck is doing, what's really good against a ramp deck is a deck that doesn't interact with it at all and just goes taller. Decks like, say, Mr. Negative, which you can't play in this format. Decks like maybe anything that can combo heavily, which most of them don't have good replacements among these cards for. So they're going to be playing worse versions of themselves if they're legal at all. Like, look at Hela. I don't know if you can play a Hela deck in this format. And then they're also going to have to contend with the full power ramp deck, the full power, presumably whatever the Shou-Lao deck is, the full power Maverick deck. My worry is that rather than creating diversity, what this does is give us a top 8 that is Shou-Lao and Maverick and ramp and maybe a Nimrod deck. That is a big problem, because if the goal here is to increase diversity, you're not doing it. So let's take a look at some of the decks that will be legal in this format, and then some of the decks that won't be legal in this format. We're going to start with Maverick. This is a classic stock Maverick build, arguably the stock Maverick build. This is just kind of what it looks like. And thanks to Maverick being a build around, this is just kind of what this deck gets to do forever. It's a cool little thing that does strong, powerful, generally on board and face up game plans, which you'd think might be a disadvantage given the cube rules. But it kind of isn't. The power is stark, the power is there, and people aren't in the mood to get bullied out of their cubes when every cube really matters. So you get a lot of people staying on 45% equity because that's technically the correct play to make. This is a good deck, a very solid deck. I won't say it's the hydrogen bomb of the format, but it is very close. In fact, the only thing that I would argue is a black mark against this deck is the potential points output of a Shou-Lao deck compared to, let's say, the also generally good against what this deck is trying to do, Cosmic Ghost Rider ramp deck, which is unfortunately for this deck guaranteed to be in the format. This deck just being legal is maybe the biggest black mark against this restriction thing, because at least the Maverick stuff is cool. The ramp deck is just, and has been, just like, this is the best deck. It's easy to play. It's strong. It's powerful. Don't change anything about it. Play these exact 12. Like, since Chamber came out, it's basically just been this, right? And so if the goal of the tournament is to make new things happen, what I really think is most of what they've done is clear the field for all the things we're already playing. They've cleared the field for Maverick. They've cleared the field for, presumably in a week, we'll all be tired of Shou-Lao. Give it a day. And they've cleared the field for this deck, which is just horrendous. It's just a really, really strong deck already. It doesn't need less competition. It doesn't need less other options. This is the deck I'm the most worried about in the field. Like to me, when I think about potential or even likely failure scenarios for a restriction like this, a lot of those failure scenarios involve, like, you look at the stats for the tournament and it's just like 40% of people are playing ramp. That's a really bad spot for a tournament to be in. Like, this is just an already very powerful deck. It won my KMBest holiday block party with these same exact restrictions, except they were less stringent. You could play more cards in my tournament. I am very worried about this. A couple of options for just where you're gonna slap Shou-Lao. Obviously, you can slap him in the zombie deck, which goes with an absorbing man. So you have Shou-Lao absorbing man and then zombie giant man absorbing man. So you basically always have something really dumb to do in terms of point output. This kind of stuff is particularly potent against the ramp decks where you really just want to go points for points with them. And if you can outpoint them, you can beat them. They don't play Shadow King, and your combo-y style of gameplay should be able to out-synergy them. This is the kind of thing that I would be very, very, very worried about in a Shou-Lao world, but at least Shou-Lao is a new card, so I'm not going to knock this nearly as much. I think, if anything, Shou-Lao might be the good guy. When you think about what everything else is happening here, it's Ramp, it's Maverick, and it's Nimrod. Okay, maybe we could talk about Shou-Lao actually being the protagonist of this tournament. Here would be Shou-Lao's heel turn, which would be if he just ends up going in the tech pile deck, the much less interesting version of the zombie deck. The zombie deck has more points, but is more vulnerable to Shadow King. This is a much less interesting way to play Shou-Lao. It's just Shou-Lao, some good cards, some tech cards. This is the kind of thing I'm worried about, where if the top three archetypes in this tournament are Shou-Lao tech, and then you have, I don't know, Maverick and Ramp, that is not going to feel different in any way other than that those decks are going to be stronger because they are going to be some of the few decks in the field. You are going to be able to play at full power. In addition, a lot of the decks that generally are built to beat mid-rangey piles are decks that are trying to combo off in some sort of synergistic way. Those decks don't have good replacements. This brings me to the second part of this video, which is check out all of these decks that I'm pretty sure you actually just cannot play in this tournament. Now, a lot of these are going to be combo decks, but I don't think you can play the Iris deck either. This is an example of when the restrictions are favoring one mid-range deck over the other. I think it's actually pretty interesting to me to figure out whether this is going to be able to stand up to Shou-Lao stuff. It's interesting. It's got a Cosmo. It's got a lot of interesting ways to move things around. How does Shou-Lao change the Juggernaut dynamic? Really interesting stuff going on here. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a single card in here that you can play in here without actually making the deck significantly worse. When you actually get down to it, what you might end up doing to make this deck make more sense is just playing something like a Majestic Wingbeat in it. But this is not a deck that really wants to be a Majestic Wingbeat deck. It's a deck where you need to add up pieces of this deck into other pieces of this deck. It doesn't want to be that. That's you making the deck worse to comply with the way in which this tournament is structured. Now, I think here is where whether this is a good thing or a bad thing starts to become subjective. Because I think generally, if you were like, I made a tournament that made hella illegal, I'd be like, all right, that's like pretty cool. Like, all right, that's nice. It's a good thing. But I do think that this kind of stuff, as much as I hate to say it, the existence of decks like this puts downward pressure on mid-range decks that I'm worried simply won't exist in this tournament. You have a thing like hella that is like, okay, what am I supposed to do here? Do I play Majestic Wingbeat in my Hella deck to make it legal? Again, this is a deck where the sum of the parts is more than what they are as individual cards because of the way it works. If you dilute that, you end up in a really awkward situation. And like this Majestic Wingbeat thing, it's cool, but you're still fundamentally playing a worse version of your own deck. And the only way you do that is if you're positive your matchup is so good that you just don't care. And I don't really feel like Hella is in that space just now. Now, whether or not Hella being illegal or is good or bad is one thing, but this holds true for a lot of combo decks. And it's not an easy thing to notice. I talked to Safety Blade, who's a really great player, after my tournament, and one of the things that he didn't notice was that it was really hard to build an ongoing deck. And so he took Echo in his deck, even though it wasn't a good card in the format, because he just didn't notice that you could do that. You couldn't really build any of the things that Echo was actually good against. And this is a similar situation where it's like, I don't think you can build a lot of the stuff that normally pressures mid-range decks downward. And Hella is one of those decks. And Lord knows Living Tribunal is one of those decks as well. Absolutely one of those decks. Perhaps the most of those decks. I don't think you can play this card at all. I just don't think you can do it. There's so many things in this format that you are fundamentally incapable of doing whenever they are decks where the sum of the parts is, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You can't just replace a card with something that is actually bad. You'll be ending up ruining your own deck. And that's a really big problem, I think, for the format. Maybe you can slap a Majestic Wingbeat in your Mr. Negative deck and it's not the worst thing that's ever happened. Again, Mr. Negative is so... It's a deck where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but also that you're not really giving up much if one of your post-negative cards is a Majestic Wingbeat or whatever. Like, that's the kind of thing you're probably actually okay with doing. And Mr. Negative is a deck that, like, can actually pressure this stuff. But generally speaking, the fact is that basically every combo or synergy deck in the field that does not involve one of these cards is gonna have to make itself worse by one card slot, whether that be Majestic Wingbeat here, whether that be Weapon X Wolverine in a Destroy deck, something is going to get worse about those decks. And those decks in an open metagame with all the cards legal are still worse than the big ones we talked about at the beginning of this video. There's really only one legal combo deck. And frankly, if I had to guess at a meta breaker for this tournament, I kind of think this might be it, but it might be a little bit obvious. But if everyone is playing those other three decks, I think there's probably a lot of equity in just being the Nimrod deck and saying, I'm gonna go beat you up. What's interesting about this is you kind of can't be a Magic deck. Again, we look at like the three decks that are like pretty clearly the best in class here. One of them's a Legion deck. One of them's a Merlin deck. We don't get to be Magic. But we don't have to be a Magic deck either. And I think I like this build of Nimrod specifically because it isn't that, which is a really interesting situation for a deck like this to be in. I think that this could be a legitimate sleeper. And as much as I've been like down on the format here, it's not so much a format problem as it is the specific context of this format, which is to say, I think you can do this kind of deck restriction stuff and have it not be bad. But I think that if the goal is diversity, it might have to be, if you're going to do this, a more curated list. for me, I personally think that restricting what people can bring, especially in a game with acquisition set up the way Marvel Snap is, maybe not the best thing to do. But I do think that there are ways to make this a lot less punishing than it is. And like this to me, honestly, just feels like bad luck. It's a bad time to do a restriction like this because most of the cards in the pool for the restriction are these very specific build-arounds from the Weapon X season. If this was even a season before, a lot of decks could have skated on, say, Spider-Man related stuff. Like, you could have a lot more diversity if the Spider cards were in this pool, but they're not. And so things like Superior Spider-Man allowing you to play an ongoing deck, right? That's not allowed anymore. We don't get to do that. That kind of stuff, losing out on it, is actually pretty big. Because when you go through the cards for the Weapon X season, they are very archetype specific. My argument is basically this. I don't see a fundamental problem with restricting people's entry based on this kind of stuff. I think it is an okay enough thing to do if your goal is a more casual, more interesting tournament. I think the specifics of the timing here are going to make this a less casual tournament. It's going to be a lot of the same decks, and the matchups are going to look like Hydrogen Bomb versus Coughing Baby. I really hope that I'm wrong, but that is my worry. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.